Good afternoon, everyone.
Hey, Corey.
Already?
Glad to see you're feeling better.
Thank you. That was not a fun experience. Well, we do have a quorum, but I'm going to wait a couple more minutes because I'm waiting to see if Jessica Goodburn will be here with us. Did everybody get a chance to read the email that I sent that was basically a draft memo for what we were looking for? Okay.
Corey, I've got, I should probably wait till the meeting's officially started, but I do have one, I think one little thing to add to that draft letter that might be helpful.
Okay, yeah, we'll be discussing that.
Yeah.
All right, it is now 3 o'clock. I will go ahead and call this meeting of the December regular meeting of the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Board to order. We have kind of a new thing that we need to do here regarding Zoom and public participation. I was sent a script to read to everybody. Thank you for joining our meeting held via Zoom webinar. When I call for public comment, please use the raise lower hand feature to let me know you wish to be recognized. Our host will allow you to talk and you'll need to unmute your mic. If you have joined us by phone today, you can raise and lower your hand by pressing *9 and mute and unmute using *6. If you are participating by phone, I'll call on you by reading the last 4 digits of your phone number. If you are participating by computer, I'll call the name that was listed when you entered our webinar. Also, I'd like to add that looks like we have some things on the agenda that are going to involve some pretty good conversation. So I would ask that your comments be limited to 5 minutes if at all possible. If you need a little more, just let me know. Okay. We'll do roll call here. I see we have James present, Jean's present, Jess is present, Kip is present, Britt is present, okay, and still haven't seen Jessica. Also, I wanted to let everybody know, if you haven't heard, Ryan Bundy resigned effective today. So we'll be waiting on his replacement for whenever the mayor is able to get to it.
I just want to put out there, Ryan in his resignation letter said that this time just doesn't work for him as a working professional. He had hoped that he'd be able to make some time work, and his employer is encouraging, but it just doesn't work with the regular duties of his workday and deadlines that he has to meet and stuff. So I guess it's food for thought. I know that we just set the calendar for next year as a board, but it's food for thought. Is there any appetite to try and find an evening meeting to maybe broaden the availability of some people?
Maybe we could discuss that during like maybe general board comments. Okay, has everybody had a chance to read the previous minutes? Okay, is there any corrections that need to be made? All right, seeing none, we'll go ahead and approve the minutes as presented. At this point, we are taking general public comments. I'm not sure if anybody hears from, the public that would like to make comments. Does anybody know who Jennifer Wieland is?
Yeah, Jennifer is on the Nelson Nygaard team, presenting with Aaron on the long range transportation plan.
All right, thank you, Ben. All right, so if there's no public comment, we'll move on to general board member comments. Is there anything other than maybe talking about moving the time of our meetings that we can talk about real quick? Go ahead, Gene.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention before I forget, I have it in my notes here, that I've been having some, and I think Corey, I've copied you for almost everything, some email conversations or exchanges with Bob Giordano. And I was interested to find that he's kind of done a little bit of semi-in-depth looking into the collisions between motor vehicles and bicyclists. And he had listed, I think, 8 just in this past month of November. So that seems like a lot, considering this is not a big bicycling month. And my intent is to continue some conversations with him, because I think it would serve us if we know, and Ben, you sent me a nice map, which I do recall seeing before, showing the location and over a 10-year period of collisions with bicycles and cars. But some of what Bob has gone into is finding out with conversations with a sergeant, I forget his last name, starts with W, Weiss or Wells or something. Anyhow, sort of a little bit more in depth about the whys and wherefores of how these collisions happen, whether it was a bicyclist coming out of an alley without stopping, or a right hook from a car, or somebody running a stoplight or whatever. So I think if I'd like to, with Bob's Giordano's help, try to come up with a little bit of a spreadsheet, if I can, with some of these a representative sampling of some of these incidents, and try to get an in-depth look of where we might help some of this out. So that's my comment. As quick, as far as the draft letter, Corey, unless you're going to have that as a separate thing.
It is a separate thing. It's under old business action item 8.1.
Okay. So
I did get your email, Gene. Thank you for forwarding that on to me. I kind of had to copy and paste into a Word document. But there were 9 incidences in November alone, which also raised a question for me about how the city is handling, particularly the police department. I know from those emails that it used to be, kind of one of those, you go in and you ask to see the records and you jot down which ones, that you noticed. And so now we have it online. I don't know, Gene, if that's something that you would be willing to monitor for us.
Well, I see, it looks like Bob is already sort of monitoring it, so I'm going to get together with him and see how he does it. I don't want to be kind of going to this Sergeant White's, I think his name is. I don't want to be pestering the same guy in the police department over the same topics that Bob's doing. So when I talk to Bob, we'll try to work something out where we can try to put together a little bit of a spreadsheet. I know part of the problem with looking at these reports is they contain personal information, which isn't supposed to be available to the public. So it's a matter of getting some of this stuff redacted. And what the police sergeant has been doing with Bob Giordano is he's just kind of giving him, he says, oh, if you want to, whether it's at an intersection or someplace else, and whether there was a traffic violation that occurred and what that violation was, that type of thing. So I think Bob is kind of keeping track of that. And so I'm going to try to find out what kind of information he's got, and maybe he can I'd be happy if he wants to pass this off to me once I find out what kind of operational stuff Bob has been doing in terms of what's the whole, ins and outs of how he goes about finding and specifying some of the information about these collisions.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Jesse, you had a comment? You need to unmute.
You're muted.
I'm not muted. My headphones are not working. Weird. All right. Anyway, I think it deserves to be on the next agenda then, so that we can get follow-up on that. So if we can have that be in the minutes that we're gonna look at that, and it'll be its own new business item, I think that would be a good thing to do moving forward, because it might be that 9 accidents in a month is average. I have no idea, but I feel like it's something that we need to, know more about. So.
Okay. Yeah, I will have Gene let me know when he gets done with his meeting with Bob and forward onto the board what they discussed. All right. Is there any other general board comments that are not agenda items? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to the comments from city staff. Are you going to want to go first, Ben, or are you going to want to defer to Aaron?
Nope, I'm going to defer to Aaron and Jennifer to do their LRTP update.
Okay, is there any objection? All right, seeing none, go ahead.
All right, man, caught me off. I thought I had a couple more minutes here before we had to jump right into it, but thanks for having us today. We're just today launching our next round of public engagement on the long range transportation plan, and it's a good opportunity to give a more comprehensive update of where we are for this board and get some feedback as part of this round of engagement, and then we'll have some additional opportunities and information we'll share at the end for continued participation from the board or anyone watching. So I'm going to I'll let Jennifer share her screen and I'll kind of get us started, and then we'll dive into things. First, just introduce, I think everyone on the board knows who I am, but for anyone watching, I'm Aaron Wilson. I'm the city's infrastructure and mobility planning manager, and part of the duties of that are running the Missoula Metropolitan Planning Organization, which manages the long range transportation plan for the region. And then I'm joined by Jennifer Wieland with Nelson Nygaard. They are the consultants who are helping us put this project together and have done a tremendous amount of work over the last couple of months to get us where we are today. So I think it'll be a fairly interesting, hopefully an interesting and an exciting update on this project. And we've got some questions for all of you, so we'll get to that. All right, so moving on. So starting off, we've given updates and presentations to this board on some of the earlier parts of this planning process. One aspect of which was to set goals for the plan. And we really wanted to have a strong set of goals that were clear and matched our community's values so that we can use these to evaluate other parts of the planning process. So looking at scoring our projects, which we've talked about at previous meetings, and now where we're at a scenario planning process where we'll use these goals as sort of the basis for evaluating how each of those different scenarios performs. And we'll get into those details. And I don't want to spend too much time on these, but just to remind everyone that we have these goals, they form kind of the foundation of the plan, and we use them as a way to evaluate the other decisions we're making in the planning process. So the process we've been undertaking over the last 4 to 6 months started with collecting projects and programs and ideas from the public and other stakeholders and agencies, and then going through a screening process to limit the projects to those that are appropriate for a long-range transportation plan. Some ideas are more programmatic, and we'll get to those in the plan recommendations, but for this process to get to our preferred set of projects, we wanted to screen for appropriate projects for the long range plan. Then we went through a scoring process where we did a preliminary evaluation of all of those projects individually to see how well they would meet different criteria related to those goals that we established for the plan. That gave us a tiered ranking system of all of the projects that we then used to develop the scenarios that we're going to talk about today. So the goal was to get as many of those high scoring, higher tier projects into scenarios as possible. Once we're through this stage, then we go into developing the final plan and doing some more prioritization of those projects that we think we can fund, and look at when we're going to fund those and what funding sources might be available. So we're kind of at the meat of the plan right now, looking at how do we identify those projects that we're going to include in the plan. So before we dive into the scenarios and go through those, I thought it would be helpful just to reiterate why we do scenario planning. It's a tool we use in long range planning and transportation planning in particular to help us create a system that allows us to more objectively evaluate different sets of projects or different outcomes and look at how well they perform in relation to those goals. It allows us to do things like look at the relationship between land use and transportation. So we can look at some different outcomes in terms of growth or transportation projects and see how that relationship between our land use and the transportation system functions. It also allows us to communicate how a multimodal transportation system can work and some of the trade-offs associated with that. If you focus on certain types or certain locations of projects, what impact does that have versus other locations or other types of projects that maybe are less multimodal or different modes. And then it allows us to understand how those different strategies and investments interact with each other to improve the overall transportation performance over time. And then ultimately, we're trying to illustrate trade-offs associated with the goals and targets. So each one of these scenarios has slightly different outcomes, and it allows us to weigh which goals are most important and which outcomes do we want to, or do we consider to be the most important for our region. And through that, hopefully make better decisions on which projects we're deciding to fund. So that's scenario planning, and I'll turn it over to, or Jennifer, did you want me to go over the growth scenarios, or do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, and then I'll pick it up with the transportation scenarios.
So as I mentioned, one of the things we wanted to do in this plan is to do better at drawing the relationships between land use and growth and our transportation system. It's something we always kind of inherently do when we're doing long range transportation plans, but we really wanted to look at having some tools that allow us to see how those growth patterns affect our transportation system and how that interacts with our transportation investments. So in setting up these growth scenarios, we took a couple of standardized approaches. One is that growth has been relatively steady over the last 20 to 30 years in Missoula, and that may change in the future. There's a lot of uncertainty there, but it has been pretty consistent. And for the purposes of evaluating transportation system, we wanted to maintain that consistent growth of about 1.5 or 2% a year. We also acknowledged that Missoula has fairly progressive land use and growth policies, and we didn't want to disrupt that. We didn't want to recommend or evaluate something that wasn't going to meet at least the minimum requirements of those, or the minimum outcomes of those plans. And so we structure our scenarios within the confines of what would be implementing those growth policies and land use strategies. So that led us to sort of two growth scenarios that we are using to help evaluate our transportation scenarios. One we're calling business as usual, which is putting growth where it's sort of historically happened, or following some trends in where growth is occurring and where there is capacity per the existing land use and zoning. So again, following the growth policy for the city and the county, but more dispersed growth within that area. And so not necessarily directing the timing or location of that growth as much. The strategic growth scenario is the second one we developed. That we worked with some of the land use planners to look at areas that had master planning, recent master planning, like the downtown master plan and the Mullen area that is working its way through city council and the county commissioners for adoption right now. And looked at what would happen if we did more to maximize growth in those areas. And then we targeted a few other central core parts of Missoula. So essentially, what happens if you maximize the focus inward more so than what we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years. So that's a strategic growth. Again, both of these scenarios are not, one's not necessarily better than the other, but we wanted to look at that difference of what happens if you really push the focus inward further than we have over the last few years.
Great. All right. So I'll grab it from here and talk a little bit about the transportation scenarios, and then share with you all some of what we saw in terms of the analysis of these scenarios and how well each of them performs against the goals. And so this land use piece that Erin just shared with you is important and will come up a few different times, because we did, as Erin mentioned, really want to test the ways that land use and transportation might interact differently as we think about looking out to 2050, which is, of course, we know that it's always dangerous to try and predict what is going to happen in the future, but looking out that far, and especially when we think about the changes that are happening in transportation, the ways that land uses are changing, it's a really interesting mix as we try and combine different projects to fill the funding that we expect to have available over 30 years. So to do that, we created 3 different transportation scenarios. And Erin shared with you our evaluation framework and talked a little bit about the ways that we used our goals to score projects and then to help shape these transportation scenarios. Just like Missoula has really progressive land use policies, you as a region also have done a lot in terms of investing in transportation and really focusing on creating a multimodal system. And so when we started to pull projects together and started to shape the scenarios, it wasn't hard to create 3 scenarios that all have multimodal elements. And I think that's really important, because sometimes when we do scenario planning for long range plans, you will have one scenario that focuses just on capacity projects, because for some regions, they are concerned about moving vehicles. For other places, you might have a scenario that focuses only on active transportation projects, because they're, for example, just so far behind that that's really where they need to program all of their dollars. What we focused on for Missoula Connect is really creating multimodal networks that advance the goals in slightly different ways. So each of these 3 scenarios that we're going to talk about, new connections, enhanced connections, and regional equity, all of them include projects for all modes of transportation: walking, biking, and rolling, transit, driving, and freight. So really thinking holistically about the ways that the system might continue to grow and advance. One other important thing that I'll mention in terms of these scenarios, and you'll see this play out when we start to look at the maps and look at the different numbers of projects included in each. We did not operate as though there's unlimited funding. While we all wish that was the case, we know that transportation funding, just like all public dollars, is going to continue to be limited. And so we used a limit of about $178 million over 30 years. And that is beyond about 110 million that is already committed in terms of some projects. That's really important, because when we look at the different types of investments, we all know that some projects are far more expensive than others. And so you'll see as we start to look at these scenarios that they do really include different numbers and different types of projects as a way to get to that 178 million that's available to spend. So keep that in mind, and then we can talk a little bit about that as we go. So I will introduce you quickly to these 3 scenarios, and then we can pause for some questions about them. And then we'll talk a little bit about how they performed relative to one another. So the first of the 3 scenarios is one that we call new connections. And in this scenario, again, these are multimodal projects, but we did really focus on projects that create new types of routes and connections. And so what we mean by that is that we are focusing on projects that expand the network that exists. There are some expansions to the roadway network, but those are with complete streets projects that provide new options for all modes. We also have projects that create new trails and bridges, and then some pretty major connections as well, including the extension of Russell Street to I-90, a new non-motorized bridge from McCormick Park to Riverfront Triangle, and a handful of other projects that really do expand the existing trail network or that expand the existing roadway network. And so I'll point out a few things on this map, which I think will be helpful as we look at the other maps as well. So you'll see some colors carry through. On all of the maps, you're going to see this sort of grayish black color of projects. And these are the committed projects. So those are about $110 million of projects that are included in the city's capital improvement program or in the MPO's transportation improvement program. So those are projects that are funded, includes the Mullen area build grant projects, as well as a handful of others around the region. A new South Avenue bridge, a few other important connections. You'll see purple projects that are complete streets and roadway projects. And so, for example, this one up here, which is number 115, is the Russell Street extension up to I-90 that I just mentioned. Another one that we've highlighted here is East Broadway and Highway 200 out to East Missoula. So those are a couple examples of complete streets or new roadway projects. And then you'll see green projects, which focus on active transportation projects. Those are sometimes bridges, they are sometimes trail extensions, and in other scenarios, you'll see different types of active transportation projects, including neighborhood greenways, trail lighting and widening, and a few other options as well. When we head to the next map, you're going to see orange show up as well, and we'll talk more about that. But those three colors really carry us through. So one of the things that you might notice as you look at this new connections map is that there aren't hundreds and hundreds of projects on here. And that is in part because New Connections does include some really big and signature projects. That Russell Street extension to I-90 is incredibly expensive and actually uses a pretty big chunk of the 178 million that would be available. So that's just important to keep in mind as we look at the next two scenarios. So the second is enhanced connections. And we really developed enhanced connections as sort of a bookend to new connections in some ways. And what we tried to focus on with this particular scenario was really thinking about projects that build on the systems and the networks that exist today. So thinking about ways that we can maintain and improve, whether they are complete streets, whether there are existing trail projects, where we might do upgrades to existing active transportation infrastructure. So taking a bike lane and making it a protected bike lane, for example. Another key feature of this scenario is that we really focused on connecting different investments and trying to close some gaps. And a key example of where you might see that is when we look at a couple of these projects that are up here near the Mullen area roads that would be built through the build grant. And these are places where we identified a couple of new protected bike lane projects to really help make the connections between the Mullen area and other parts of the region. Really, these are key connections as we start to think about how we get folks into downtown Missoula, how we get folks around the rest of the heart of the region. So that was a really important focus for us as we were developing this scenario. A couple of the key projects that are included here, aside from the England Boulevard and Union Pacific to Palmer protected bike lanes that I highlighted, we include a good number of safety projects. And so those are the projects that show up in orange. I mentioned that you would start to see orange in a couple of these maps. Those include a lot of intersection improvements, which can be everything from improvements to make it easier for people walking and biking to get across an intersection, to projects that might focus on traffic calming or new signals in some cases as well. So lots of different types of improvements are captured there. This scenario does also include, as I mentioned, some protected bike lanes. It includes complete streets, which are some of the purple projects that you see. And then importantly, there are a lot of neighborhood greenways that are included within this particular scenario. That is an important change between the last long-range transportation plan and this one, which is that rather than just including neighborhood greenways as a single line item, each of those that I believe this body has reviewed in pretty great detail are included as separate projects within the plan and within the scenarios. So I'll just do a quick flip back and forth between new connections and enhanced connections so that you can sort of get a sense of the order of magnitude of investments we're talking about here. So here's new connections again one more time, and then back to enhanced connections. So you can see that there are a lot more projects included in enhanced connections. Again, we're talking about the same amount of money to spend, but a lot of lower cost projects that again really focus on expanding existing systems rather than creating new systems. So then the third scenario is one that we call regional equity. And the way that we developed this scenario was by adding some weighting to the scoring of projects around our equity goals and criteria. So we really focused in on equity and affordability. And then we also tried to focus in on projects that are in some of the Invest Health neighborhoods. And the Invest Health neighborhoods are places where we have concentrations of different socioeconomic variables and demographic characteristics, and also places that really struggle when it comes to health outcomes. So part of our focus here was really thinking about ways that we could provide new, affordable transportation options for people that would offer opportunities for making connections to jobs and services, making connections to schools without necessarily having to rely on a car for every trip. So this scenario includes some similar projects to enhanced connections, but does really focus on the connectivity between key neighborhoods and also really doubles down on some of the most affordable transportation improvements, including a lot of neighborhood greenways. So you can see that there's even more green that starts to pop out on this map compared to some of those that we looked at before. This scenario includes some trail lighting projects, so Bitterroot trail lighting. It does include some extensions of key trails, including the Milwaukee Trail extension, and then adds in a handful of protected bike lanes and some of the really key complete streets projects like Howard Razor that make connections between neighborhoods. So that is a slightly different focus from enhanced connections, but again, some similar projects here. So I'll flip between enhanced connections and regional equity just so you can take a look at those. So here's enhanced connections and then regional equity. For folks who are wanting to look at these in more detail, these maps and lists of all of the projects that are included are on our website. And then we also have an interactive map that you can use to explore them in more detail. And we'll share those links with you as we move forward. So given the focus of this board, we did want to provide just a quick look at the active transportation projects that are included. So across these scenarios, we have about 57 active transportation projects, and those are projects that are just specifically for walking and biking alone. They don't count the complete streets and safety projects, most of which do have elements that improve conditions for people walking, biking, and rolling. So we have 12 different neighborhood greenway projects included, 13 projects to either construct or expand shared use paths, 13 projects that are new or improved multi-use or commuter trails, and then a handful of bridges, on-street bike facilities, lighting as well. So again, we did really try and prioritize projects in the scenarios that would help to advance our goals and that would build out the multimodal system in lots of different ways. So before we go into the findings of the scenario analysis, maybe I'll just pause for a quick second and ask if there are any questions about those three scenarios before we talk about how they perform. Any clarification I can offer?
Gene, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. As I was listening to the protected bike lane areas, and I'm not, I think one of those was on reserve. Is that correct?
We have a good number of different protected bike lane projects. The couple that I highlighted specifically were England Boulevard and Union Pacific to Palmer, that connection out to the Mullen area. But there are there are many different protected bike lanes that we've included. There's a portion of reserve, I think, that includes protected bike lanes and other facilities as well.
Well, I just use reserve because I drive it a lot. I don't bike it very much, but I drive it sometimes all the way up from the big box stores down to 93. And one of the things, obviously, if you drive it very much, there's a lot of, once you get past, I'm going to say 7th, you're going to see a lot of side streets and parking lots for businesses to turn into. So you have the southbound traffic on more vehicle traffic on reserve, and they have, of course, their center dedicated turn lane. One of the problems with this, as people, and I've had this driving, people waiting to turn into the parking lot off of that center lane, they have 2 lanes of traffic to keep track of, and they're looking for an opening. And as they're looking for an opening, once they see one, they want to go. And when they want to go, their focus is usually not on anybody who might be in the bike lane or even on a sidewalk. And I think that having I don't know what the answer to it is, but I don't believe that the protected bike lane will protect these types of potential crashes because it's just a matter of human nature. The cyclists are often, whether they have protected bike lane or not, are going to say, I've got my bike lane, I'm good to go. The people who are looking to make that left turn across both traffic lanes and a bike lane and a sidewalk, their main focus is on the traffic. And as they commit to making their turn, oftentimes you're not going to see that smaller object, the bicyclist or the pedestrian. So I'm not sure, while the protected bike lane might save a rear end collision from somebody who's texting, for example, and I'm not sure how many of the crashes that have happened on reserve are those type of crashes. But I think we need to be careful when we look at a solution, or what we believe to be a solution, such as a protected bike lane, that are still protections that are still going to be missing, and we need to recognize those and understand them and deal with them. So that's my comment on that aspect.
Great. Thank you. And that's really good feedback. I will note that when we talk about the types of solutions that are included here, there are some projects that have been on the books for a while and are maybe a little bit better defined than others. And then there are some cases where we know that an improvement is needed and might not know exactly what the facility looks like. There certainly would be a long ways to go in terms of design. And so really, as any of these projects move forward, what is so critical is to be digging into those details, looking really carefully at the crash history, both reported crashes, those near misses, understanding people's travel behavior and the key connections between the destinations, so that any type of project that moves forward is able to account for exactly those kinds of realities you're talking about. So thank you for raising that. It is not something that we can say at this point, this is exactly the right solution for this location in all cases. And Aaron, I'm sorry, did you want to chime into that as well?
Nope, I think that was a great answer.
I just want to kind of take the opportunity to remind the board, this is very high level, 30,000 foot view or higher. And even though there are specific recommendations in projects, they're very undefined at this point. And it wouldn't be until a scenario is selected, a project list completed, a project identified for funding, and then designed, that we would actually get into the level of kind of detailed discussion about facility types and specific challenges and how we might overcome those.
All right, Jesse, had a comment or questions?
Yeah, I would just add that I would consider the new connection plan to be the I-90 connection takes all plan. I would consider the enhanced connection plan to be we're going to make good things better plan. I would consider the regional equity program to we're going to make bad or non-existent exist or be better. That's all I want to say.
You're hired, Jesse.
You're not playing your hand on which one of those you like better, huh? I think that's some of the feedback that they're looking for. Correct me if I'm wrong, Aaron and Jennifer, but I think they want you to, we know that the final scenario will likely be a combination of some of these. And so they wanted to create them as different as possible to kind of force you to choose what aspects of them you like about them and what ones you might not like. Knowing that the finished product will be likely be some combination of them.
Great point,
Anybody
Ben.
else have any questions, comments? Sorry, did I interrupt you, Jennifer?
No, you're fine.
Okay, all right. Brett, I haven't heard from you. Okay, go ahead.
Did you just call on me? Is it Britt?
Yes.
I just wanted to say that I liked the the regional equity plan, that the extra greenways. It seemed to me like a really good idea, and to use the transportation system to help everybody. I think that would be what I would be more supportive of if I had to pick one of the three.
Okay, thanks, Brett.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, oh, Corey, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry. This question is probably more for Aaron. I'm curious, we might have already gone over this once before, but what do you guys use to determine what projects are going to be priority?
Yes, that's part of that previous process that we went through over the summer, where we did a call for projects. So we had a variety of ways to get people to send us their ideas of where they think we need improvements, where there's deficiencies. We also had a number of small group meetings with other city and county and state DOT staff to get an idea of what projects that are on their wish lists. And then all that kind of gets brought together, and then we put it through that screening and project evaluation process that sort of gives us that preliminary sense of what are the projects that are going to be the most impactful sort of on their own. And then those projects got programmed into these scenarios. So it's sort of a whittling. You start with kind of the realm of every possible idea, and you slowly whittle it down into the projects that we're ultimately going to be able to fund, because as Jennifer mentioned, as much as we all wish we could do all of them and that there's a need for all of those improvements, there isn't money. And so we've got to have some way to prioritize.
The piece I would add to that, I think, is that in that evaluation process, when we're really tying back to the goals and looking at, so what I'm showing on the screen here is related to evaluating the scenarios, but when we evaluated the projects themselves, we looked at probably close to 30 individual metrics and scored 200 plus projects against those metrics that relate to the goals as a way to start understanding which kind of rise to the top in terms of doing the most. So that is the first step. And then when we're at the scenario phase, there's another evaluation that is happening, which is some of what we'll share with you all today. And then there's that final mix and match for the recommended scenario that will get us to that prioritized list. So it is a multi-step process, Corey, to get from 200 projects to, let's say, the top 70 or so that would be the recommended.
All right, thank you, Aaron and Jennifer. I appreciate that. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Okay, I guess go ahead, Jennifer.
Okay, all right, great. So we've started to hear from a few of you about which of the scenarios are resonating with you and what you're liking and not liking about them. And we will have some more discussion about that, I hope. We also went through a pretty robust process to evaluate how each of these scenarios performs. And we tied this back to our goals and looked at about more than 15 metrics in thinking about how do we assess safety and health? How do we look at climate and think about vehicle miles traveled, greenhouse gas emissions? How do we think about connectivity and accessibility? What are these different scenarios doing to connect jobs and houses and neighborhoods and people? And then what are the opportunities to really support economic development and vitality, and invest wisely. And so what you're seeing on this particular slide is the way that each of the scenarios performed against a handful of metrics. And so what should jump out to you, I hope, is that each of these scenarios moves us toward our goals because they are made up of projects that do exactly that. Now, each of them also does that in slightly different ways, and some do it better than others depending on the goals that you're looking at. So what you can see at a quick glance is that any of the metrics that we're showing in orange are more supportive of our goals within that scenario than those that are shown in the lighter blue. But again, none of these scenarios are moving us in the wrong direction. So that is a good thing. We'll talk about a few of these measures in particular that Erin and I thought might be of interest to the board. But part of what might jump out to you is that when you start to look at the darker blue and the orange, you see that enhanced connections and regional equity are doing more towards some of the goals along many of these different measures. And especially when we start to look at our goals that are around the connect and strengthen communities to create a more equitable region, and then also around a few of the safety and economic development goals. So we'll focus in on a few of those pieces here quickly for you. So this is a quick look at a few pieces of data. So to assess the ways that the different scenarios could support safety, we did a few different things. It is not good practice and not really possible to predict with projects at this level of detail how many crashes you might be able to eliminate or reduce by moving forward with these scenarios. But what we did do is look at the locations in the region where over 10 years where there have been pedestrian and bicycle involved collisions, and then we actually also looked at all collisions. Again, this is based on reported data, and so some of the discussion you were having earlier about what isn't shown in the data is important to bear in mind. But we laid the different transportation scenarios over the crash locations to try and understand where we might have the opportunity to improve safety. So if we assumed that all of the projects that move forward within a scenario would have safety countermeasures built in as appropriate, we start to see an opportunity to really improve safety as we move forward with any of these projects. The numbers that we're showing here on the screen show you that the enhanced connection scenario would cover or would touch about 202 locations where there have been previous collisions. And the data that we're using is 2007 to 2018. But I hope what you'll take away from this set of numbers is that all three of these scenarios do give us the opportunity to improve conditions at locations where we have had a history of collisions. We also looked at connectivity in a couple of different ways. And each of the scenarios does something for connectivity, but again, as I mentioned, that each scenario enhances connectivity in different ways. We focused on bike connectivity, and we also focused on multimodal connectivity. So the new connection scenario, which does include a lot of complete streets, it does include some more roadways. That scenario does a lot for multimodal connectivity, for freight connectivity, but does a little bit less when it comes to bike connectivity. And so one of the analyses that we did was building on something that was done in your bike facilities plan. And we looked at the miles of connected low stress facilities that each scenario would help us achieve. And the two different numbers that you see here show you the miles that would just be level of traffic stress 1, so the most comfortable facility, and then commuter trails. And then the second number, the number on the right, is showing you all existing bike facilities built in. So we wanted to recognize that there are folks that feel comfortable riding on a facility that is not level of stress 1. And so we wanted to get a sense of how connected the networks are. So what you can see here, and this probably won't surprise you, is that enhanced connections and regional equity help to create a lot more miles of connected low stress facilities than the new connections scenario does. And as you saw, those two scenarios have a lot of different bike projects, a lot of the neighborhood greenway projects. So that is part of the story there, with regional equity doing just a bit more on that front. And then the last example of the analysis that I'll share with you is a look that we did at affordability. And so for this particular piece, this is another very simple overlay where we looked at all of the 2018 locations where there is affordable housing in the region. And so these are locations that are mobile home parks, that are low-income housing tax credit locations, where there is, again, existing affordable housing. And we just looked at how many of those sites would be served by each of the different scenarios. You can see that regional equity touches more of those locations where we have existing affordable housing, but enhanced connections and new connections also help us increase the connectivity to affordable housing. So that was something that was pretty important to our Citizens Advisory Committee, is really understanding the ways that this plan could help to advance affordability in the region. So the last thing that I'll mention in terms of the analysis, and this is just another look at a few of those key metrics where you can really start to see the ways that at a glance, regional equity is doing a lot for our equity goal, our affordability, and then increasing the walking, biking, and transit trips. The new connection scenario does a lot for greenhouse gas emissions, in part because of some of the new connections that are made. And then the enhanced connection scenario is one that really enhances connectivity, both in terms of bike connectivity, but also for people walking and those driving and freight as well. The last thing that I'll mention here is just that when Erin talked a little bit about the growth scenarios before, we talked about strategic growth, which really focused on a little bit more infill versus the baseline as usual, or our business as usual growth. And what's important to know about the growth scenarios laid onto any of these transportation networks is that strategic growth is really an amplifier. So the performance of each of these networks against the outcomes is better under the strategic growth scenario. It's not always a huge difference, but across some of the metrics, especially connectivity and accessibility, across equity as well, we do see better performance of all of the scenarios when we think about more inward focused growth. So that is the last piece I'll mention there. Erin, maybe we'll have you give the how to participate, and then we can go into questions on this. I mentioned that we have all of these projects on the website so that you can understand a little bit more what's included in each scenario. There's more information about the analysis available, and there is an interactive map. And again, we'll share the link with you so that you can turn on and off the different scenarios and learn a little bit more about each of the projects that's included. So hopefully that will help as you continue to explore these a little bit more. Erin, do you want to do this, or do you want to close? We should stop and do this.
Yeah, let's do this since it's fresh.
Okay.
Yeah, and we can wrap up with
next steps.
Yeah.
Okay. So we won't pull up the interactive map now just for simplicity, but we would love to hear from you all about your overall impression of the scenarios, if you have a preference between them, and then if anything jumps out as missing.
Okay, go ahead, Jess.
Okay, so I really like the second two scenarios. They, as far as the bike pedestrian board, give twice as much low stress biking, and that's makes them super, I think, powerfully different than the new connections. And so I like the second two for that reason. I just don't like the idea of one interstate connection taking all of the funding. I just don't think that that serves all of our community's core values. I like the safety and the connectivity of the second plan. And it has 88% of the connections to low income housing as the regional equity plan. And so although it is billed as being the enhanced connectivity, it's almost like it's a regional equity one too, because they are accomplishing kind of similar things. And I do like I do like that we're improving the safety of the intersections. I would like that included in the plan. I do think that we should have the expectation that if you are making a choice to live in Missoula, that you have a certain expectation of multimodal transit options for you, no matter where you live. And so all the children in Missoula have equal access to different modes. And I think it's important to grow without ignoring neighborhoods that are sort of islands already. With that being said, I like the Mullen Street bike connection because that huge development we know is going in there, and those people are going to need a bikeway to get to access the core of the city. And so I really, really, really think that's important for strategic planning. But I think that's all my notes.
Okay, is anybody else? I kind of want to share my thoughts as well. The two scenarios that impressed me the most are the enhanced connections and the regional equity, though I'm leaning very much toward the regional equity, mostly because it addresses more of the low-income housing, the equity part of all this. But something that one of the areas that is important to me as far as types of projects really are closer to pedestrian related than so much bicycles. I mean, I know, here with this board, we're bicycle pedestrian and we put a lot of emphasis on bicycles, but I would like to start seeing, some projects that are specifically to try to help making Mullen safer to cross, or there's some parts of Brooks, that kind of thing is some of the things I would like to see happening. And I haven't really gotten a chance to look at the map yet, so I can't address if I see anything, critical that is missing. But yeah, I would go with regional equity. That's my thoughts on that. Ben, you have something?
I just have a couple of questions that might help clarify and get some more juices flowing, more ideas. One is, what is intended or included in the greenways projects that you describe in the enhanced connections? Is that the sort of minor intersection traffic calming control treatment and some sharrows and signage, or is it the major intersection improvement changes? Are those part of the greenway projects, or are those major intersections standalone projects?
In general, the major intersections are standalone simply because of the cost that's associated with them. I'm trying to think about whether there are greenway projects that do have the major intersection improvements built in as part of the greenway itself.
I believe,
Aaron.
Yeah, we did. When we were looking at the cost of the greenways, we were doing sort of the linear cost of doing the signing and striping, and then we were looking at what types of intersections. There's local street intersections that you can do quick, easy, cheap improvements. There are sort of collector level improvements, and then there are arterial. So all of those have a slightly different cost, or potentially substantially different cost. And so we tried to factor that into what it would cost to do each of those greenways.
I guess I remember when we kind of did that exercise together, Aaron. What I'm curious about is if the major intersections have their own project. Like once we get to a project list, will they have their own project ID number separated out so that those could be tackled? Because I keep my fingers crossed. We haven't come to the board yet, but I think that we're getting to a place where we're going to see implementation of the basic greenway infrastructure at a city level, kind of a coordinated rollout beginning next year. And so it might be really helpful from a city staff perspective to have the major intersections called out and identified and ranked. I hope that doesn't send you backwards in any way. I hope that's something that can be pulled out afterwards, but it might be helpful.
I think they largely are. As I'm taking a quick spin through some of the greenway costs that we have included. There are a few of those greenway costs that are quite high and make me think the major intersection improvements are included, but most of them are overall relatively affordable, and so I think are separated. But we'll double check that. So thanks for that, Ben.
Okay. And then could you go back a couple slides to the scenarios against the goals? This one.
Mhm.
So I noticed that greenhouse gas emissions scores really well, or new connections scores really well on a greenhouse gas emissions goal. And that's an important goal for the community, and one that we, especially as we head into winter inversion, is going to be even more meaningful. Can you talk a little bit more about the difference in how each of the scenarios performed on greenhouse gas emissions? And can you talk a little bit about the modeling that goes into, like, what are some of the assumptions that are made when evaluating greenhouse gas emissions?
Mhm. Yep, absolutely. So we mentioned that we used a few different tools in terms of the assessment that we did here. And we used the regional travel demand model to understand some of what we might see in terms of the performance of these scenarios. I will note that a regional travel demand model is good for many things. One of those, and most importantly, what it's good at is assessing the ways that people driving perform. And so it works really well when you're looking at major roadway improvements. A regional travel demand model is not great at understanding what multimodal improvements and especially walking and biking improvements do in terms of people's travel behavior, in terms of vehicle miles traveled, and then that translates to emissions and what we see there as well. So we used the regional travel demand model, which was helpful, and then we did some post-processing of that model to try and make it a bit more sensitive when it comes to the ways that people walking, biking, and taking the bus might choose to travel. And then we did a lot of off-model analysis as well. So one of the things that we didn't see a lot of difference on, and again, this is because of the tools that are available, is that all of the scenarios, when we compare to the base in 2050, and so that means in 2050, if we assume that the projects we know are moving forward are built, but we don't do any of the scenario projects, if we compare to that, we see that all three of the scenarios do reduce vehicle miles traveled from the base. But what actually makes the most difference is the strategic growth scenario. So getting more people closer to destinations does more to reduce vehicle miles traveled, and then also helps to increase the proportion of walking, biking, and transit trips. So that's an important thing to understand. Now, the reason that you see greenhouse gas emissions look the best when it comes to new connections, and the order of magnitude difference is not huge here, but part of the reason for this is that when we do the greenhouse gas emission assessment, it is first based on vehicle miles traveled, but then there are also assumptions built in about delay and so vehicle delay and about the mix of vehicles. And the new connection scenario, in part because of that connection up to I-90 and some new roadway connections, actually reduces vehicle delay a little bit compared to the other scenarios, and that translates into a little bit more greenhouse gas emission. But we did see vehicle miles traveled go down in all of the scenarios, and again, strategic growth is really the piece that makes the biggest difference there based on just the model tools that we have available.
Great.
Did that help?
That's very helpful.
James?
Is that me?
James.
Oh, James. Sorry.
Thanks, Corey. Would like to say that tried to give the benefit of the doubt to the new connections model. The major benefit of the greenhouse gas reduction, which is mentioned, is very beneficial for the whole city, as was mentioned before, and I'm sure the economic benefit would be outstanding. And not to mention just the quality of life and the more within reach, certain benefits would come to that part of town. However, with the regional equity, the thing that really stood out to me was and while the slide is up, if you, in the comparing scenarios, it highlights the walking, biking, and transit trips. And it just seems like that singular benefit of in particularly enhancing transit trips across the city will reach so many people, much more, I would think, than just a small extension to the interstate, which would have a more concentrated impact. So I'm highly in favor of the regional equity for that purpose.
Thank you, James. And that's a really helpful way, I think, for folks to think about the differences between the scenarios is what has a broader regional impact versus what might have a more localized impact in some ways. So thank you for raising that.
Thank you, James. Gene, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think along with most of the others that have spoken, I think I'm kind of split evenly between the enhanced connections and regional equity. The one thing I just kind of wanted to ask, and I'll wait to ask it for a second, but in terms of the bicycle facilities, I'm very happy with the move towards the neighborhood greenways in terms of connectivity and lower stress for the 8 to 80 range. At the other end of the spectrum, I think from safety standpoint, as well as getting more people to make use of some connections, the more we can look at trying to get grade separated pathways as opposed to either bike lanes or protected bike lanes that are on the same grade as a roadway, I think are going to encourage more people riding a little bit more than the bike lanes when we can fit them in, especially in some of these newer growth areas. So I think I'd like to look more towards the what they call cycle tracks and things, and it tends to eliminate, I think, or reduce at least some of the right hook and left cross scenarios that I mentioned before. And then my question is, to what extent the anticipated growth, because I do anticipate personally a growth in the use of e-bikes, electrical assisted bikes, with the aging population, and I'm part of it, along with the lower price of these e-bikes as they're going down a little bit, more and more people are buying them, are going to be using them. It's going to extend their distance of anticipated use. And it's going to also increase their speed because these can hit 20 with electric assist. So I'm wondering how much over the next 10 years or so, even, not to mention 25 or 30, the anticipated growth in the percentage of electric assist bike use is coming into play when we're doing this kind of planning.
It's a great question. So I think it's really important when we think about facility design and we think about the need for separation between people moving at different speeds. Part of the way that we tried to factor that in our analysis is there's an analysis that we didn't show you today in terms of accessibility, where we looked at access to jobs, schools, parks, and social services within certain travel times. And we looked at 15 and 30-minute walking and biking distances. And when we were talking about the speed to use for those assumptions, we did have some discussion about e-bikes and what that might mean in terms of how much further people could actually go within 30 minutes. So we bumped that up a little bit from what we might typically use to be able to account for the greater distance that folks might be able to cover. But I do think that the most important way to really factor in the increasing use of e-bikes is thinking very carefully about facility design. We know that that e-bikes are really encouraging biking by a lot of folks who wouldn't have biked before. And so that makes the need for low level of stress facilities increasingly important. And I think also really amplifies the need for separated facilities so that people moving at different speeds have that space. But Aaron, feel free to jump into that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of pieces on the e-bikes that's partially related to the investments we're making, but also just good design and acknowledging that if we hit our mode split goals in the plan, there's just going to be a lot more traffic on our bike facilities, which is, can be a good and a bad thing. And if you look at places like Portland or maybe even Seattle or some larger metro areas that have these pinch points where you get a lot, people from a larger area all sort of using one facility, it can lead to congestion of, almost what you would think of it from a cyclist who's been doing it for 20 years and is used to having a bike lane to yourself. When you start having 10, 15, 20 cyclists ahead of you at an intersection and thinking about how you accommodate that kind of traffic, or having passing locations. So if somebody is on an e-bike and there's other traffic in the bike lane, how do you facilitate that? So a lot of it to me comes down to those sort of, how are you designing those facilities, and are we designing them with adequate capacity and creating opportunities for moving people at different speeds? So maybe not so much related to where are we making investments, but how are we designing those when we actually get to those projects?
Okay. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Okay, do you have any more, Jennifer?
We will just close out with ways for folks to get involved. So Aaron, go ahead.
Yeah, so we have kind of a whole, like a blitz of public involvement activities that are really kicking off today with this meeting, and we're presenting to planning board this evening. We have a series of neighborhood meetings where we're trying to take a more focused approach to different parts of Missoula. So allowing people to think about this plan in the context of their own neighborhood or sort of area around their neighborhood. So we'll be doing those starting next week on Tuesday. You can find them through the Office of Neighborhoods website or on our project website, MissoulaMPO.com. There's a list of all of those. You can sign up for those meetings. It's just a quick Zoom registration so we can keep track of how many people are planning to attend. So that's one way to get a similar kind of opportunity to discuss these scenarios. We also have a ton of resources on our website, which I think is going to hopefully will be really useful. And I encourage everyone to go there and spend some time with this, because I know even for myself, I have to look at these things for a while and take a couple of days and really spend some time with it to fully understand all of the things that we're putting out there, because there's a lot of information and it can be kind of complex. There's a lot that goes into it. So all that information is on the website, and you can spend 5 minutes or 5 hours or 5 days on that. Again, we have that survey that asks some basic questions about which scenario is best meeting people's needs and which elements of each scenario they prefer. Jennifer mentioned the interactive map. That's a much more useful tool than some of these static maps that we show. So you can really look at specific areas, explore projects in a little bit more detail. And then we'll have a series of posts and continued updates through our Facebook page. So if you want to, I'd encourage everyone to share those posts and try to get more people exploring these scenarios and providing their comments, because the more feedback we get, hopefully the better decisions we'll make in terms of meeting the needs of our community. So that's kind of a snapshot of what's going on. And then the next steps. So we're starting to get into the final stretch of the plan. We're at this December, January timeframe where we're refining the scenarios and starting to develop some programmatic recommendations, or will be sort of over the holidays. And then we will come back in either January or February with the draft plan and what comes out of this stage of feedback and the scenario evaluation, and start to land on what we think is going to be the recommended plan. So that'll be another key stage to get some input to make sure that we've got that right. And then hopefully we'll have the plan adopted by April, fingers crossed, assuming we don't have other major disruptions like COVID that hit. Hopefully we're through that and we're sort of coasting, or at least maintaining where we're at. But that's the plan. Great. I think that's all we've got.
All right, Jesse, you have any question or comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that everyone is clear, because we want to be advocates for bicycling and pedestrian facilities in the community. And so in all these scenarios that you gave us, is the best way for us to do that, to advocate in that way, to go and fill out the survey? Or what do you think, as far as the board goes, aside from the feedback you've received during this presentation, would be the best help for you?
That is a great question. And I would say yes, as many folks as we can get to take the survey as possible will be really helpful. As Erin mentioned, it asks you to weigh in on how well each of those 3 scenarios meets your needs. So very similar feedback to what you all have given today. It invites people to tell us the types of projects that are most important. So for example, if neighborhood greenways is the project type that's most important to you, it gives you the chance to share that information, and then also to provide other comments. And that could be, for the board, for example, if you would want to weigh in specifically on the need for as many active transportation projects as possible, that would be perfectly appropriate. So the survey is a great way to do that. And then certainly joining us for any of the community meetings to talk about specific parts of the region would be great. But hopefully the survey gives everyone that opportunity as well.
And I think the only thing I would add is that we've heard good feedback today. I mean, you sort of have the benefit of being on the front end of this, and so you're sort of setting the stage for which scenarios are going to best meet our needs. And so hearing that many of you are drawn to the regional equity and sort of focusing on some of those issues like affordability and the safety and connectivity is really helpful. Like, we take all that input. We don't just come and present and sort of passively listen. We take all of that, and that goes into our evaluation of these scenarios, and we'll use that moving forward when we're deciding which of these is going to be the best approach for our region to take. So I think you've already sort of helped us in what we were asking for today, if that helps answer your question.
All right, does anybody else have any other questions or comments for Erin or Jennifer? All right, doesn't look like there's any. Thanks for presenting on the long-range transportation plan. Appreciate it, guys.
Great. Thank you all so much. Thanks for the feedback.
Okay, next is Ben's report.
Yeah, and I'm really not going to take much time. It's only been 3 weeks since we met last, and those 3 weeks had holidays and Thanksgiving in them, and so there's not too much to report, other than to say that at the last meeting I had told you that I would likely be presenting at this meeting on the neighborhood traffic management program that we're developing. We've pushed that back to January. It is going to go to council before then for a kind of check-in to make sure that they think that we're on the right path as well, before we come and present where we're at in a little more detail to the Bike Ped Board at the January meeting. So that is where that's where you'll see that, if you were expecting to see that on the agenda and wondering why it wasn't there. Other than that, don't really have too much to update you on, other than to introduce, and I meant to attach this and I didn't, so I'll just send it out in an email to think about for next month. But the other thing I wanted to put on your radar is that we have the draft 2021 Public Works project list already. So last year we didn't get it to April or so, and this year we already have it. So it has a variety of overlays and chip seals on streets that either have existing bike lanes and we're going to get them back, or places that we've identified that we want bike lanes or crosswalks. And so we're going to have our work cut out for us in kind of prioritizing those. I mean, ideally we get them all, but with the outreach needed to all of the adjacent property owners and things like that, we might have to prioritize some routes over others. So that'll be a good discussion at the January and February meetings about that. But that's about all I have. I guess, as you may have heard, there was a pedestrian fatality at Reserve and Mullen last week, or maybe even the week before now. I haven't gotten much detail from the police other than that it was a known person who might live in the area or might reside in the area currently, who had been picked up earlier that day for panhandling and I don't want to use the term playing in traffic, but really being out in the street recklessly, and had gone back out and was back out there and was struck. And I don't know the exact details of where or what the driver was doing, but it was a jump out in front of traffic sort of situation. It was not a kind of accidental someone's crossing the street in the crosswalk with the signal and a driver did something terrible. I'll get more information from police and we're working to look at this a little bit closer at staff too. And the data question about bike ped injuries and crashes, collisions is a good one. And I want to just remind the board that we have maps at the MissoulaMPO.com website to look at bike and ped crashes. There's maps for each there. And then also the community transportation safety plan that's also on the MissoulaMPO.com website that has some more in-depth analysis of the bike ped crashes that have happened. And with their non-motorized crashes, that's even an emphasis area within the community transportation safety plan. And in a non-COVID year and in a year, we had been planning on getting a work group together around that emphasis area that would include at least one board member. But with COVID and with the high number of projects that the MPO is undertaking, we just haven't been able to get that committee off the ground this year. But that's on our agenda for 2021 is to get that committee going, and that plan includes some recommended action items to pursue, and so we'll start looking at those and trying to tackle them as we can.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Does anybody have any questions for him before we move on? All right, seeing none. I don't think anybody had any committee meetings, so I don't think there are any reports, right, James? Okay. Then we will move on. Sorry?
Because I've been away for a number of months and just back on the last 3. What are the current committees right now?
Currently, there is a right-of-way committee, and then this last spring, the board created a safety and education committee. That one hasn't been utilized at all. With the work plan coming up, I'm going to be suggesting a couple things with that. So that's the only committees we have are the right-of-way committee that James chairs and the new safety and education committee.
And who chairs that?
No one chairs it yet. We haven't used it.
Okay, I'll put myself in to chair it, certainly.
Okay. All right, so
I guess I want to just speak up for a minute about the committees. When that committee was formed, that was right around the time that Corey and I were meeting with Marty and talking about what does a committee do and how do we, what are the requirements? And when you have an official subcommittee, there's all of the public meeting requirements, and so it's onerous for staff to help the board members meet those. And when we looked at some other advisory boards, they do things and discuss things outside of board meetings in smaller groups, but don't do anything that's actionable outside of a public board meeting. And so the idea is that, or I guess the thought is that we don't need formal committees necessarily. Instead, rather identify projects that need to be taken on and people who want to do those and do them. And then when there's discussion and decisions that need to be made by the board, that those people can bring them to the board meetings.
Okay, that kind of confuses me. So nothing actionable can be done, but yet it could be considered a board meeting because there are more than, especially if there are more than 2 members, that's not considered a meeting. So if let's say me, Jess, Gene, and maybe Brett, we want to get together and talk about these safety and education things, we can still do that without it being a meeting, correct?
Yeah, but then if you were going to write something and like discuss the action item, like an actual piece of advisement that you were going to offer the city, recommend how we were going to fund something, you would bring that to the board then to actually vote, to discuss and vote on.
Okay, yeah, I guess I've just been really confused about that. And I think some of the rest of the board is too, especially considering how we try to emphasize not to use email for any discussion. So, yeah, I just wanted to make that point.
It really depends on what the item is that's being discussed. If it's a statutory, if it's, you guys are statutorily required to provide advice on the long-range transportation plan. So continuing the discussion from today's presentation by email would be a violation of your public meeting laws because you're providing advice and discussing the long-range plan at these public meetings. Whereas if a safety committee wanted to explore the idea of, wanted to look closer at data or wanted to explore the idea of, I don't know, a helmet giveaway or what, I'm just thinking of something that hasn't been talked about at a meeting before. That doesn't need to happen at a meeting.
So you could have a group of 3 or 4 people discussing what's the best way to get lights or helmets or provide regular on-street safety checks, with volunteers or whatever. Those are the kinds of things we discuss as a group. None of those things are actionable, but we could come up with something to say, oh, we'd like to get this on an agenda because.
And then you would say, we need to get this on an agenda, and here's what we're going to be asking the full board to weigh in on.
Okay.
But you need to be able to develop the items to bring them to the full board. I don't think it's reasonable to expect that to happen individually at all times.
Yeah.
I think it's a good idea, and it's going to save the staff a lot of time. And so I feel like it's like a win-win, is we can kind of flesh out what could be brought to the whole board, and then it saves the staff from having to do a full committee meeting with all of that. And then when we are ready to present, we could put it on the agenda and then discuss it.
Just my concern with this, not using anything formal, is running amok with open meeting laws. I mean, like I said, there's confusion about emails. So I guess maybe can we ask, I guess I can email Marty or something to get a little more clarification to share with the board. Because, especially, we've got 2 new members that aren't aware of how this stuff is done. So I guess with that in mind, what is everybody else's feelings about retaining the any committees, really, I guess? Gene?
Yeah, I think what you're saying about going to Marty and saying, are we going to be able to deal with this the right way and not run amok of open meeting laws, I think is and I'll try to write up sort of a little bullet point scenario or something of how we might be discussing something regarding the right of way or regarding safety, and say, well, this is a discussion or a working group or something, like whatever we want to call it, and here's, let's say, what the group discussed and came up with, and now decides that they would like to have on the agenda, and is going through these situations of discussion and agreement, and then saying, yeah, we're going to present to put this as an agenda item we agree that this group of 3 of us agrees that this should be an agenda item, and we kind of have it worked out why we want this done when we come to the full board meeting. And then to say, okay, looking at, sort of a storybook thing of how this would go forth, then maybe Marty would have some things to say, yeah, this works or it doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, why it doesn't work.
Yeah. Okay. James?
Yeah, I think that, again, I would encourage it to be more, not just have a large group, a large subgroup of this board meeting, but like if Jesse wants to get with some friends and neighbors and and talk about ideas to bring forward, and then bounce one of those off of Gene, and then say, yes, this is something that we should bring to the board. That's how I foresee that working. I guess I'm not talking about a working group of 4 or more board members together, but rather, and again, it has to depend on what the project at hand is. And like, so the what we're calling the right-of-way subcommittee, I mean, James and Jessica are kind of actively working with neighborhoods, and their membership on this board does not matter for the work that it helps maybe, but it's not like they need to do that as bike ped board members. They'd be doing it whether or not they were serving on this board. They'd be trying to identify areas within public right-of-way that could be better utilized and help the neighborhoods that they're working in do those. And so I don't know that that's an example of one that doesn't need to be a subcommittee. If that became a whole bunch of board members all working on specific projects, then maybe we need to reevaluate that. But right now it's 2 board members and a handful of other friends and neighbors that are working on things that their participation on this board doesn't factor in. Maybe they'll develop maybe as they're working on this, they'll say, hey, you know what, we should really, the city should create a program for this. And so we need to recommend that the city create a program. Then they need to say, okay, that's something that the board is going to make a recommendation on. And so we're going to draft something and bring it to the board and then have discussion at a board meeting.
Okay. I mean, I don't have a problem just as long as we don't run afoul of open meeting laws. James?
Yes, Corey, I would second what Ben said and reiterate that I don't think dissolving the subcommittee would impact the work that we're doing at all. And any actionable effort would include all of the bike ped board. And working in the work that we did this past year before COVID, when we could meet, I didn't really see any type of activity that would even raise the question of breaking the public meeting law. So I think that should rest probably. And without Jessica being here, who's the co-chair, I think that she would probably agree as well. But I think Ben has a really good point.
Okay. I mean, technically we are not on agenda. So I would move that we table this particular discussion to another meeting. Is there any objection to that? Okay, we'll table it to January or February or something. Ben and I will get it figured out. The next item we have is old business. It's the Higgins Street reduced speed limit request. I don't know if I can share my screen so that people who have not read it can read it. I got dual screens, so I'm not sure how this would work. So what I have written, I addressed it to Jeremy Keene because unless the board disagrees, I think Jeremy, as director of Public Works, is that what he is? That, our city department is probably better equipped to help us with this, more than going to like a Public Works meeting or going again to the Department of Transportation. So that's why I've addressed it to Jeremy Keene. Then the text of the request that I wrote is there are some safety concerns that the BPAB has concerning the Higgins Street Bridge project. We are aware that some improvements have already been made. However, there is a particular issue that the board would like your help on. Please stress the need for a lower speed limit on the bridge for the duration of the project. Many bicyclists feel unsafe crossing the bridge, and we feel a lowered speed limit would help the confidence of the riders who do use the bridge. While there are many ways into downtown, many of those routes are out of the way and the trail system does not connect properly to make that detour a sufficient option. These people need use of the bridge during the project, and so the board asks that you use what resources you can to encourage the Montana Department of Transportation to temporarily lower the speed limit on the bridge. And I did include the BPAB city email address, Ben, and I tried to send something to that and it didn't work for me either.
Okay.
So just let you know that. So I just go ahead and open it to any discussion about, wordsmithing or any other thoughts about that.
I want to suggest that you address this letter to the mayor's office and city council. Staff has already taken up this cause and has been working with MDT. And so any further letter to staff like that, again, this is why, Corey, we had that kind of back and forth by email in advance of this meeting, is that staff is on your side on this one, and we don't know what else to do. And so that's why I was questioning what is the efficacy of this letter and what do you hope to have happen with sending it?
Okay, yeah, I hope that this was clear, Ben.
I think it is. I just think that addressing it to the mayor's office and council might be more appropriate than just to Jeremy. I would CC Jeremy on it.
Okay.
As well as, and you've currently CC'd me and Aaron on it, and I would add Kevin Slovarp, the city engineer, to that list.
Okay. Jess, you had a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great idea as far as, we know that lower speeds decrease fatalities. And so I feel like the evidence is strong for that. That was part of our discussion in one of the prior meetings about lowering the speed limit citywide. And so perhaps inserting some language about what we know, which is that lower speeds decrease fatalities might be good. And then what exactly would you like it lowered to? I mean, I think that those two pieces might be important to add to it. I've done some more thinking about the bridge, and I've noticed the signage, and I've seen the sharrows, and I've driven over it in my car. And I do think, like on reflection, that every individual has to assess risk on their own for their behaviors. And so I do think that, we each have a responsibility for ourselves to decide what are we comfortable with and what are we not comfortable with. But if we know that a certain speed lowers fatalities, then that's the way that you can structurally change a scenario to at least, better protect those people who are bicycling or having encounters with vehicles.
You're muted, Corey. You're muted, Corey.
Sorry about that. I thought I had unmuted myself. So what exact number are we looking for speed limit? Are we looking for 15, 20? That's something that I think should be in this as well, other than just kind of generically saying lower speed limit. Waiting for anybody who wants to think on that. Go ahead, Gene.
Yeah, I think, speed limit right now is 25. I think 15 is reasonable. And one of the things I think maybe Corey, and I I wanted to, agree with Ben also, what Ben said about going to the council rather than Public Works in the mayor's office, I think is a good route to go. One of the things I would add to the argument, if that's what we want to call it, is that it's very typical in construction zones to reduce speed limits, whether it's on highways or arterials. And so the purpose of that is to reduce risk to construction workers. Well, right now the construction workers are put at no risk essentially because of the big concrete barriers. But I think the point could be made to say, we reduce speed limits during construction to protect highway workers, and it's just is reasonable and actionable to put construction-related reduced speeds, such as going down from 25 to 15, to protect other vulnerable people who may be affected by this construction. In this case, it's the people on bikes. So I would use that as an extra wedge, if you will, to try to get the action we want.
Okay, thanks, Gene. I wanted, before I get you, Jess, I wanted to really quick see if Brett had anything to say. She's usually always on the phone, so I want to make sure that she had nothing to, what she had to say.
Yeah. Hey, Corey, thank you so much for drafting a memo. I think that is great. I kind of almost think that who we send it to matters a little, but mostly just being on record saying that we believe this is necessary. I think it's really important. If there is a bureaucrat out there that wants to do the right thing, maybe we can give them something to stand on. I do think cars are going too fast. The posted speed limit is 25. There's times when they're clearly going 32. I think it's unusual for people to actually go 25 when given an opportunity of a long straightaway like that with the double yellow. I think they do tend to go a little faster. And I personally think that a 15-mile-per-hour speed limit would be respected the same way people respect other construction zone speed limits. And I think enforcement could help with that. And I think it could make a huge difference and possibly save somebody's life. So I think we need to send this letter and go on record saying that we think people need to slow the heck down on that bridge.
Okay, thank you, Brett. Jess, go ahead.
Okay, so I want to just say I support the 15-mile-an-hour speed limit change. And I think that the strongest point I agree with Gene on was that it is true that individuals who are adults assess risk for themselves. But his point was that it is a structural change, like changing speed limits, that protect vulnerable populations in a community. And so when we're thinking about children, when we're thinking about, people who may have a disability or a hearing problem, lowering the speed limit we know is more protective. And so I just want to say I support that. And if you wanted to add language about particularly watching out for vulnerable members of the community, I think that is a powerful message.
Okay, James?
Also in support of the letter and as it's worded, would support a 15-mile-per-hour speed limit reduction set at that speed. 20 is also really slow or can feel really slow when you're in a vehicle. I rode over the bridge today around midday, not just for the purpose of experiencing it. It was the first time riding a bike over the bridge, and it is quite a challenging experience. I would say that the drivers behind me were extremely courteous. One was more courteous and gave me about 30 feet of room. And I attribute some of that probably to the signage, giving recognition to how important, how much awareness like signage like that can create, and the impact that I felt from the improved signage. Really, it carried me northbound successfully and got me to protected bike lanes. But I noticed coming back on the southbound, once you get back into the hip strip, you're completely unprotected again. And I'm wondering if the city would have the ability to maybe continue some of that signage that confirms with drivers that if the sharrows are worn away, some improved signage further down Higgins might actually help raise the comfort level and improve the sense of comfort for cyclists heading southbound.
I'll certainly look into that, James.
Thanks, Ben. I was just about ready to ask you to do that for us. Appreciate it. Gene?
Yeah, just real quick, the sharrows are there on the hip strip, and yeah, they're worn down. But even when they're there, and along with a number of other streets, the actual meaning of them, the intended meaning, is lost on virtually all the motorists and probably about 80% of the bicyclists. So the bicycles, they use full lane signs that they have up for the north and southbound Higgins Bridge, I think are much more readily understood in terms of what motorists should expect from bicyclists, and enables the motorist to then understand that they need to provide that space. About 4 or 5 days ago, I did use the bridge like James did. I made a crossing into town and then came back. On the way back, of course, coming south here, going uphill, I was maybe going about 8 miles an hour. I waited for the traffic on Higgins to clear the light and fell in behind about 4 cars that started ahead of me. And then there was a truck that made a right turn off of front onto the bridge. Once I checked out that truck in my mirror, that he was about a good 20, 25 feet behind me, wasn't crowding me, then I just totally ignored him for the rest of the bridge and felt very comfortable. Again, there was nobody that was, beeping at me or gunning their motor, etc. So again, just that's one experience, but putting that together with James's, I don't know what Britt's had recently, but I think those signs have help with the understanding and patience of motorists at this point. But of course, that the 15 sign would just add that extra oomph that I think is definitely worthwhile. We should go forward with it.
Okay. Any other suggestions before I read this off? Is this something that we need to do like right now, or because I can just move to readdress this letter to the mayor and staff, CC additional people. Ben, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to ask you later who those others were. Include the 15-mile-an-hour request. Include language about considering vulnerability, and adding continuing signage into the hip strip. Okay.
I'll second it.
Okay. I'm sorry. Any opposition?
No,
All right.
I don't think we need to put our again a thumbs up on this and wait for the next meeting. In another 3.5 months, it's going to be a moot point. They're going to have that section done, and we'll have a 13-foot wide shared use sidewalk to take care of the issues. So I think the sooner we get it out, the better.
All right. So if there's no other discussion, we'll go ahead and I'll make sure we got everybody covered. Anybody opposed? All right, seeing none, I will get this rewritten, and Ben, if you'd be available to maybe help me with some wordsmith, just to make sure that I have it right. And then I will submit it as soon as possible, hopefully within the next week. Okay, then the next thing is the project works list. All right.
Is the next thing the 2021 calendar and priorities?
Yes, sorry. Yes, that's what's next. Jesse, do you want to kind of go over what you've done with the sheet?
Yeah, hold on. Got to log back in. It logged me out. Okay, so basically the work plan just shows all of our statutory obligations and around when they are scheduled, and then what potential impact the board would have, most of which is just issuing advisory opinions. Some of it is administrative, just relating to our schedule, nominating officers, things like that. And then Ben plugged in the staff time commitment that each of the topics would take. And then I tried to include whether in the schedule these things were yearly, if they were every other year, or things like that. And so it basically just gives a nice, like, rough framework for especially for new board members to see what the year looks like. I did reflect on the bike month probably the most because it is an event that we want to support, and potentially members of the board are going to commit their own time and resources to. And so I gave it 2 separate meetings for us to discuss it. And one of them should be April instead of being May, the actual month of bike month. So that would be the only thing I've changed in thinking about it further. But otherwise, I think, it's a nice sort of just administrative framework for us to have, and then hopefully also engaging with our partners in the community and the public who want to come and hear and give us feedback on issues that are important to them, like sidewalk repair or safety, or getting a bike sharing program up and running, and ideas they have. And hopefully if we have a schedule, then that would allow people the opportunity to participate more fully. So that's about all I have to say about that. I don't think, because it's just an internal document, we don't have to approve it or anything. I just wanted to see if anyone had questions, I guess.
All right, thanks, Jess. Does anybody have anything they would like to talk about on here or add to it? Okay, if not, I would move that.
Hold on a second, Corey. I want to say thank you to the board and to Jesse in particular for spearheading this. I think it's going to be really helpful to help as we kind of conceive of what the calendar year looks like, and as we prepare for meetings, it'll help staff bring better presentations to the board, knowing what you want. And I think it'll help Corey and I put the agendas together a little bit quicker and easier. So I applaud the effort on doing this. Even though I did put it as an action item, and I guess I was picturing the board adopting it or approving it in some manner, I agree that it's probably not necessary, especially if it can and maybe should be a living document that changes as new information comes to light and as board members have ideas about things. But it's a really great start and very helpful for us to, or at least for me, to be able to look at and think about what the board wants to know about.
Okay.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. I appreciate your work on that too. Then I guess I want to find out what the other members think about this. Should we just leave it as like an internal document and just follow it from year to year and make changes as we need? Or do we want to adopt it as something official and informal? Okay. Then I guess I'll withdraw my motion and we can just leave it as a document that we refer to through the year. All right, and finally, the 2021 draft public works project list. I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but you just want to go on what you got, Ben?
Yeah, like I said, I didn't get a chance to upload this in advance of this meeting, and when I was looking at the time after the long range plan update, I didn't think that we'd get to even look at it if I did a share screen or something. So I think I'd rather let us go early than try and cram another discussion item in. I just want to say that I'll email out the list ahead of next month's meeting, and it will be attached to the agenda well in advance, so that we can have good discussion about it in January.
Okay, all right, Ben, thanks. Does anybody have any announcements they want or need to make? All right, seeing none. Our next meeting is, I believe, January 5th, 2021. Let me make sure. Yes, January 25th, 2021. It will likely be here on Zoom as well until further notice. So I will go ahead and call the meeting to adjourned at 4:53 p.m. Thank you, everybody.